Well, I think we have had a lot on the economic outlook as well as what the budget had to offer. And currently we'll give floor to, or we'll give time for people on the floor to just give us some questions and maybe some input on the presentation that was done. But before that, maybe just for me to open up the floor and maybe just to gauge and to make my panelists also comfortable. I would really just want to ask, probably firstly from Flores, I just want to find out on, with the status quo, high household being indebted, inflation increasing, with the current issues or disputes now between Russia and Ukraine, and also looking at interest rates increasing, what does that really mean to individuals, corporates, as well as for investment in the Namibian economy?
Maybe I can just, as an introduction, say I work in the financial markets. So I'm an economist in the asset management industry. So I'm not a development economy expert, but some of the things that you touch on is extremely important to us as well. I have a little bit more of a concerning inflation outlook than what Robert showed. He seems to think inflation probably sideways, maybe down later on. I think we're going to see at least a 6% inflation sometime during this year. We've seen the fuel price hike, now the recent hike. We've seen a fuel price hike again in South Africa. So the transport inflation rates for Namibia and South Africa is very high, and I think it will rise further. The oil price now in Namibia dollar terms is about 1,750 Namibian dollars per barrel, which is a record high. It's never been this high. And the rate of increase in the Namibian dollar denominated oil price alone is like meteoric or parabolic, as they say. The oil price in US dollars so far this year alone is now nearly up 50%. So in Namibia dollar terms, it's even more. So we've got an inflation issue, and that will obviously impact us all directly. Now, you've got the fuel story, which is a once-off direct impact, but you also have second-round effects because of the input process, which will eventually filter through to other areas. Now, the theme of tonight's talk is monetary policy and fiscal policy. Now, monetary policy, as we know, like Robert alluded to, as far as we are concerned, largely to do with interest rates. But it is a much broader policy environment than just interest rates. It encompasses your exchange rate regime. I think we're all familiar with our exchange rate regime. It also encompasses financial stability oversight issues, like I think your opening remarks when you talked about the banking system is, for many people, it is a bit of a black box. But monetary policy, I would say, is like the oil in an engine. And the best monetary policy is the one you don't know about, which means things are going all right. Once monetary policy issue or as a debate, or people start relying on it or not, then it becomes a bit problematic. Now, unfortunately, it seems to me like we are going to have a bit of a stagflation issue in Namibia. 3% real GDP growth, which I agree with more or less with the outlook that Robert sketched, is really inadequate for Namibia. It doesn't move the needle much in any direction. And then on top of that, if you have a high inflation rate, then you've got largely this concept called stagflation. And hiking of interest rates, which is supposed to slow inflation over time, in this instance, is probably not going to have much of an effect because it is a cost shock, an inflation cost shock. In other words, a global shock, which we can do nothing about. If you, under these circumstances, want inflation to really come down, you basically need to kill the economy with much faster interest rate hikes, which means you slow the economy further, and then you basically have a demand collapse. But even that, I think, will really struggle to get Namibian inflation rate down. Now, as an economist, we always have this issue between what we want to describe reality, like Robert did tonight, to describe the picture and the reality. Then you try and take a view on what policy is going to actually do, what is going to happen. But then you also try and take a view of what should happen. So we always have this tug of war between what is happening and what we think should happen. Overall, I think the Namibian consumer is under pressure. We've got the inflation shock. We've got the prospect of higher interest rates. Now, interest rates mostly affect people with debt. So if you have a house mortgage or you have a car loan, etc., then you're going to be affected because disposable income is now a bit lower. You pay a little bit more on your payments. But I think for a large portion of your population, they are already so indebted, but not with the conventional banking system, where interest rates are at usually levels in any case. So I think that is where we have a problem, is that we've got such a large portion of the population that is very indebted that hiking or lowering of interest rates are going to make very little difference to their well-being. So I just want to just highlight things regarding the Ukraine-Russian situation. Yes, the primary effect that we are going to feel is via energy prices, oil and fuel, but we also have a confidence shock. So people are anxious. People are, and we see that in the financial markets very directly with volatility. We've seen the global equity market falling so far this year. I think we are now down more than 10% for the year in US dollar terms for the global market. Some markets are more down than others. But we also see a bit of a benefit in our neck of the woods, where we have seen a shift from investments in Russia to the equity market in South Africa. So the JSE equity is doing very well and is up. And we've seen quite a bit of buying, offshore buying in South African equity market. So there are winners, like for instance the big mining houses are winning because of the very strong commodity prices they're enjoying. But there are also losers because we've got a property industry listed on the stock exchange that has got direct exposure to Eastern European assets, Eastern European properties. And those have been hit hard in terms of valuation. So there we now see the other side of the coin. So let me stop there before I ramble on too long.
This might be slightly off the level of discussion with regards to the budget. I think the budget is pro-youth. I want to find out from your side, do you think this is the right direction we should head into, given the panic that Flores just touched on now, with fuel prices increasing and everybody being uncertain?
I think pro-youth is very important, and it is probably the right step to take. If you look at Namibia's population pyramid, we're very heavily skewed to young population, so obviously you can't not take the youth into consideration. If you look at we did this exercise a couple of years ago. Obviously, everyone who's going to vote in the next election has been born already, right? Because they'll have to be 18 within the next couple of years. And if you consider the upcoming elections in 2024, around 65% of the eligible voting age population will have been born from the mid-80s onwards. So they'll be relatively young, 40 or younger at most. And they will account for 2/3 of the potential votes available. They won't have the same recollection of the independent struggle, the ties to the ruling party that a lot of their parents do. And so they will be the big driving force if they do come out to vote. That's the first part. But if they do come out to vote, they will be the driving force behind Namibia's next government. And so obviously you do need to take them into consideration. I do think the big challenge, though, is that obviously we sit with very high youth unemployment, and if you look at unemployment, unfortunately, our last data is only for 2018, and so it's very, very outdated. But even in 2018, I think if you look at ages around 15 to 24, the unemployment rate then was around 60%, so almost 2 out of every 3 people. And that's not that statistic excludes people in school and university, and that is very concerning. And so obviously for people in those age groups, especially those who are unemployed, inflation will bite. And I mean, I think the one important consideration for Namibian inflation is that overall demand remains quite weak. Given the situation we see with households, obviously very highly indebted, the ability to take on debt is difficult because they're already highly indebted and it's a risk environment, and so the demand is a bit weak, but also the willingness to lend might not be as high also because of the high credit risk we face. But that's why we see inflation, not shooting the lights out in Namibia over the next sort of year or so, and that's because one of the largest parts of the rental or of the inflation basket is the rental component, which is around almost a quarter of inflation. And with relatively weak demand, it's difficult to see how we're going to see high rent escalations as we did around 2016-17, when inflation was much higher, touching the double-digit levels. But as mentioned, it's going to be in food and fuel prices, and that's where it really does hurt most people.
Well,
Sorry, maybe I get for interest's sake, to what you said about the inflation rate in Namibia, the measurement and the weights that are so outdated, is that in Namibia, alcoholic beverages and tobacco is about 12.5% of the basket, which is the highest in any basket you would care to compare it with. So it looks like Namibians are really smokers and drinkers much more than the rest of the region. And and unfortunately that is impacted also by the budget, talking about fiscal policy, some taxes specifically. So that is also a question of debate where we've got the official inflation rate, right? And there are contracts that are based on the official inflation rate, like inflation-linked bonds. Inflation-linked bonds protect against inflation, but it's based on the official rate. So it doesn't matter if you agree or disagree with the official rate. It doesn't matter. The official rate is the rate. And it is measured as having a big component of drinking and smoking in there.
Well said, Florence. So this time around, we will be taking questions from the floor. Welcome questions from the
I want to talk about commodities a bit. So obviously with what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, obviously, and the conflict, we've seen a lot of commodities companies basically pulling out given the sanctions and such. Like we've seen, like, let's say, talk about oil, BP, Shell are pulling out, right? And we know that Shell is just discovered some oil offshore in Namibia. Do you think because of that there will be greater investments, especially from commodities companies into Namibia? Obviously that would be great for our FDI.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Clemens Mdoga from Untitled Foundation. Obviously, with the shift or the increasing energy prices now globally, we will also probably see a shift from fossil fuels to renewables. Could this also be like an asset for Namibia, also with the whole hydrogen bus and potential other income streams in terms of renewable energies?
Good afternoon, my name is Charles Mokwaso. I'm the CEO of the Engineering Council of Namibia. 2015 projects were slashed and they were affected. So I started attending sessions such as this one. Now, my question, or rather two questions. The first one, according to what I've heard so far, the budget is pro-youth. But I looked at all the allocations, I just don't say it. If there's anyone that can just break it out down for me to say this is why it's pro-youth, I'll really appreciate it, but I do not see it. With the exception of the 360-something million to the Ministry of Youth. Everything else doesn't really concern the youth, like directly. And then the second one is just, I think last night, or is it tonight, fuel is going up, the fuel price. Last night. Yeah. So this is obviously after the budget was launched and so forth. And if I remember well, the budget was launched before some of the international issues that are going on now became more serious. So can we say then that maybe all the speeches that have been made so far can be revised? Because there's likely going to be a lot of things that are going to change. Like there's already talk of Russia, for instance, getting back at the West by slashing the oil output. And at least Western economists are worried that if that happens, it's going to basically widen the crisis that even Western countries are already going through so far. And as we know, Africa just receives, whether it's problems or good things, we just receive. So, is there any chance that maybe all the speeches that have been made prior to the activities in Eastern Europe can be revised? Because I think we've been too optimistic. And then lastly, the construction industry, especially from Robert, maybe if I can get some sort of indication with regards to government policy. Is there any is government policy, economic policy at the moment, that if there is one, is it really geared towards getting us back to where we used to be or where we were prior to 2014, for example? Is there anything like that? Because all I'm hearing is that there's probably not going to be a census now. I don't know. So we have all these years, whose figures, economic figures and other figures, we don't know right now. We are working basically on outdated figures. Is someone scared of what the numbers could be? Why isn't there a budget specifically? Why isn't the government saying we haven't had census in the longest of time, so we need to dedicate funding for census to happen, to be concluded this year? Because we can't be talking about the budget, we don't even know where the actual numbers stand right now. So who is afraid and why with regards to census? We should do the census.
My name is Martin Zur, Entity Switzerland. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Floris, for your speeches and for your content that you brought across. The rebound, the economic rebound, Robert, as you brought it across, was mostly dependent on the carrots, that could be administered to the future prospect. And I realized once more that the rebound in the economy is quite dependent on a handful of mining houses, the performance and their willingness to invest into the economy. My question is, this is the lumping risk, that is coming together for the economy of Namibia. Is there any indication that government is going to or intending to diversify that risk into the SME sector? And if so, what would be the measures and the indicators in the current budget that has been told us by last week? Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Can we keep in two? Maybe I'll just one that comes to me that has a bit of a personal connection is Charles, the engineer, talking about the construction industry. The construction industry basically collapsed. If you think about the overall GDP numbers we show on a quarterly basis, the construction industry is probably now a third or less than what it was previously. And we've seen numbers of developers going bust. And I personally have taken a lot of pain in the property market. Let me just leave it there. So it is difficult to see where the spending is going to come from into the construction industry. I don't know if the slides that Robert showed, if anybody picked up the fact that when the spending of the government accelerated so much in 2011, 2012, thereabouts, there was a program brought in called PPEG. And a lot of the confidence in government finance that brought about that initiative has been the exceptionally sharp growth in SACU revenue for a number of years. I mean, there was a time when SACU revenue was like 2 billion per annum, right, into the Namibian coffers. Then it doubled to 4 billion odd. And then it doubled again to 8 billion for a year or so. And then it doubled again to 16. And then it went to 20. So a large reason why the spending levels of government is where it's at was due to the accelerated in SACU revenue. Because I mean, if you continuously get salary increases every year, 20, 50% increases, you're going to also like to spend a lot. And a lot of that went into the construction and all of that. So when that tap was closed or to a large extent or flattened out, it directly impacted construction. And then we also had, I believe, if you also think back to these slides, there was a period when interest rates were kept too high for too long, post-2016 or into 2016. That is when we should have cut interest rates. In South Africa and in Namibia, because then we had a growth scare globally in 2015-16. I don't know if you will recall the oil price collapsed in that period as well, and we had a growth scare. So we had interest rates stay too high, which hurt the construction industry, and the central bank introduced what they called macroprudential guidelines, with deposit requirements for investments in the property industry. which they kept in place for too long. Only when we basically now had a property collapse, they relaxed that macroprudential guidelines and we cut interest rates into the COVID crisis, which was basically too late. So hopefully, with interest rates staying relatively low compared to history, and let's call it normalization. Interest rates normalize a little bit from where they're now. We've got the economy normalizing a little bit over the next few years, like you said, coming out of the dip, going back to pre-COVID levels. That's a bit of a normalization in the economy. We've got a bit of confidence coming back to people generally. And we must remember the Namibian economy, okay, we are dependent on mining to a very large extent for the growth rate. But the economy consists of a large number of sectors which also operates. So if we have normalization, for instance, in the retail wholesale industry, we've got a bit of normalization in manufacturing. Manufacturing is actually quite large now. We've got a normalization in the financial industry. I mean, the industry that we are in was also in a big recession the last 2 years or so. So if we normalize, the outlook for the financial sector is fairly positive going for the next 2 years. Because if interest rates increase, banks' profit margins improve. So banks become more confident in doing business. And if we are through the worst of COVID, then the insurance companies will also do a little bit better because they don't have all these big claims and they also don't have big lapses on their policies. So there is an outlook for the financial sector to improve a bit. So if the government's policy is currently, what do we call it, balanced consolidation? Balanced fiscal consolidation in the sense that they loosen the reins a little bit and don't have it so tight. That could also help a little bit. So it's all things that contribute, I think, to the outlook. So I'm hopeful that we have a 5-year period. We have to think about a 5-year period where we could have a fairly okay cycle. And we mustn't forget we're coming out of a deep crisis. And if we can get a positive cycle, then that can make a huge difference to a lot of sectors, including construction, hopefully. What else did you say, Charles? Oh, you talked about the speeches. I made that, I'll stop with that. In 2020, we had 3 budget speeches. When COVID broke, we had a budget speech, COVID broke, we had a supplemental budget, and then we had the October budget. So, I don't think we're in a similar crisis situation where the global situation affects us to such an extent that it will throw out our budget numbers completely. So no, I don't think they will repeat the speeches. I think whatever comes up, they will save for October.
Yeah, so starting off with the question of commodities, I mean, what we see with this, especially with Russia, quite a substantial global commodities producers, obviously the sanctions there are positive for commodity prices or increases. It just depends on your exposure to those commodities. And that's where we saw South Africa was very lucky last year with the rise in platinum group metals, so PGM prices. That assisted South Africa's government a lot. They got better revenues than they were expecting, and that helped. And it also resulted in a current account surplus, which meant that the rand was a lot stronger because of that. Our exposure hasn't been as lucky. Our largest export is diamonds, and obviously in times of crisis, diamonds tend to sink because it's a luxury item. We did have gold exposure, and that was nice, but it's not as substantial. And so that is a bit of a challenge. I think where we might have some luck going forward, obviously, is depending on what happens in the uranium space, a longer term. In oil as well. So I mean, it's still highly speculative with the Shell and Total discoveries. But we're still waiting. We know that there is oil. The question is it commercial or not, and that takes some time to find out. But that is very positive. Firstly, that they have found some oil, so it's positive for exploration spend. And then, from there determining whether it's commercial or not, that obviously it's a binary event. Either it is or it isn't. But from there, it can have a huge impact and it can change Namibia's trajectory quite dramatically. But even just the confirmation that there is some oil is very positive. I do think we are seeing increased investment in the mining space, but I think it's important to bear in mind that you don't invest in mining because the policy space is so nice, right? We see mining in some of the most conflict-ridden countries across the world. You go there because it's economic to extract those resources because you mine where there is gold. You can't mine gold where there isn't any in the ground. And so I don't think we must confuse investment in mining too much with the general policy. It's more due to the ores available or the resources available as well as the prices and the cost of extracting them. In terms of energy prices and renewables, I do think that Namibia can leverage that shift quite positively. And I think obviously with the European reliance on Russian fossil fuels, there is a bigger shift to try and move away from the reliance on the fossil fuels. If we should entirely sort of rely on a single industry, I don't think that's really the case. I think Namibia does have an opportunity to position itself very positively as a renewables country. So not necessarily renewables for one thing, but renewables in general. But that comes down to creating a policy space that's broad, not again focused to a very specific area. And not just necessarily renewables, but also clean energy sources like, again, the nuclear fuels such as uranium. But again, that requires a shift to the policy environment. I mean, there's no reason why Namibia couldn't be, for instance, a net exporter of renewable energies, but your challenges from baseload energy aside. In terms of the budget, it was very much pro-youth in the speech. In the numbers, not as much, and that is the worry. I mean, we do see incredibly large levels of expenditure directed to things like the Ministry of Education, and we spend a lot on education in absolute terms and per student if you compare regionally. The danger, as I mentioned earlier, is the quality of that spend is quite poor. We have a lot of graduates who come out unable to speak and read and write English very well. Their maths isn't where it needs to be. The science and the chemistry is quite poor. And those are the building blocks you need for a future for the youth. And so the quality of that spend needs to be improved. It's not just that we need to spend more on it. And I think in terms of if you really want to be pro-youth, you need to get growth going and get employment going, and to do that you need to make it easier for a lot of the youth to tap into their entrepreneurial skills, make it easy for them to start a business. You don't, not these lengthy, physical processes. Apply for things online. Submit forms online. Most of the youth have access to a smartphone. Why do you need to go to a branch in Windhoek if you're living somewhere far away to submit copies? A lot of these things that can streamline the processes and make life easier for a lot of young people. And even in terms of tax reform, for instance, so a staggered corporate tax, as opposed to just one flat one, where your large multinationals pay the same level as well, for instance, as what a new startup would. In terms of sort of fuel prices and uncertainty in the speeches, look, as I mentioned at the start, those who know don't predict, so it's difficult to say. We're not an oil exporting country, so obviously, if you're Angola, you can change your budget nicely now because oil prices are a lot higher. For us, it doesn't have too much of a fiscal impact. It does have an impact for people on the ground, obviously, and on that spend, but I don't think any major changes there. Obviously, there are a lot of things that could change. What happens in Ukraine? Does it become larger? Does it pull the rest of the globe into it? Does it sort of carry on as is for a while or for a short while? Does it die down? But that's very uncertain, and I don't see much use in speculating on right here or right now. In terms of the construction industry, I think the outlook for the industry has changed. The nature of the industry has shifted, right? We don't see any major projects anymore. The bank headquarters are completed, airport upgrades are completed. It's effectively just sort of the major projects at this stage are the road upgrades. Where we do see government increasing its expenditure, it's not on the development budget where you would see increased construction. And so obviously there isn't much in the pipeline for the construction industry, which is a concern. I believe the nature of the industry has shifted as well. The focus is no longer on Windhoek. Windhoek seems pretty dead from that perspective. It's a lot of smaller projects spread out across the country, and I think it will take a while for that to change. I think on the positive front, we might see could be positive for the construction industry. But I mean, the industry is on its knees, and we've seen a hell of a lot of consolidation there. I think in real terms, I mean, the industry is back to well below 2010 levels now, probably. So it's collapsed. On the census, I mean, we are effectively making policy in the blind because we don't know what's going on, and that is a major concern. The other concern is that a census doesn't catch you by surprise. It happens once every 10 years. You know every 10 years it's going to happen. So the fact that money isn't found for it is quite surprising to me and disappointing as well, because you knew the expenditure was coming. Revenue was increased, the revenue outturn was increased for this year. So I mean, I think, you know, we could have found the money. Expenditure was increased by about 2.6 billion compared to what was estimated in the mid-year budget for the upcoming financial year. So, you know, it's not that you need to spend $1 billion on a census. There are ways to make it cheaper, but we need to know what's going on. As to speculation, as you know, do we not want to know? I mean, I don't really know anything to that, but I mean, if I just think of what we've seen, you know, from about the last surveys we had around 2015-16, we saw a lot of deterioration on socioeconomic indicators compared to the prior years, and obviously things have worsened since then. And so politically, it might not be as ideal to see how bad the situation has got to have hard numbers to back it up. But I mean, that's purely speculation at this stage. In terms of the rebound and sort of concentrated on mining, but mining is a big part. It is a big export industry. There is a lot of value in it. In terms of diversifying the economy, that is where we speak about, you know, broad reforms, not very singular or sector-specific reforms, not government picking a sector and saying this is what we're going to focus on, this is the winner. This is where we think allow it easy for anyone to come here, start a business, whether it's Namibian or not. If you've got the capital or the skills and you come here and we provide the conducive environment, you know, allow that to flourish as opposed to picking winners. I mean, you can put all the smart people in Namibia in a single room and decide which sectors to pick, but they will miss something. And so, you know, putting all our eggs in the basket like that isn't worthwhile. But at this stage, we don't see policy moving in that direction. In fact, we see it moving in the opposite direction. You know, the policies we see are very, of late, are more sort of economic nationalist policies, and that's not what we need to see. If we look at the investment promotion facilitation bill that was tabled and withdrawn last year, it's very counter to anything of this nature. You know, it scares away foreign investment as well as local investment. You don't see Namibian business wanting to invest in an environment like that, where you know, you've got policies that are introduced like that, as well as that make it more difficult to bring in, you know, scarce skills where you do need scarce skills. So that's it.
Well, I feel very sorry for the youth, the young people, the students. The speech of the minister was for the youth, but it's actually cynical to be saying at least. There was nothing for the youth, nothing. And because what the youth wants is jobs. I'm often in Katatura, people who don't have any education or hardly any education. And if you ask anybody in the street, behind Evelyn Street, in Greenwall, talking to young people, the only thing is they want bread, they want somewhere a job, they want 1,000 or 1,500 a month, just small work, just to get going. And I don't see, sorry to say that anybody from the policymakers is concerned about the question of demand of labor. There's no concern. There's no concern. We talk about commissions of employment and all this and a lot of stories. But the real questions are evaded. The real question from the investment bill, nobody from the Ministry of Finance has got it in his speech. You will not see it. It's not there. It's not in existence. You will see also not, there are so many researchers and economists at the Bank of Namibia. They will not write one paper, not one paper, on the reasons of the capital outflow. They will not write. They will write not one paper on the real reasons of investors not investing. They don't write. Now, is it because it's too sensitive? Because it will not be so sensitive. Once the youth realizes there's no job, then the sensitivity is gone. And I tell you, I'm often in Karatura. The young people are not happy anymore. There's no work, it's crime, they're looking for something, and this is defection. And it will come up, this thing will come up, and the policymakers must really do something. They must ask these sensitive questions. I'll give you one example. When Kalle was PS of Finance, he was one of the few who already said that shouldn't be closed in Namibia. At that time, it was an 800 million business. Now, a few years later, because of politics, because it's ego, if a country has got an airline, it's 4 billion. But then it's 4 billion. We know from the Nekadal, it started with 3 billion, it's 5.4 billion. And this money is lost. It cannot go into SMEs, projects for employment creation. We know from the fuel storage, the filers with the Prosecutor General, it's 7 billion approximately, from 1 billion. 6 billion lost. What can we do with 6 billion in this country? Because it benefits a few, only a few, a handful, 5, 6 people. And I'll tell you one thing which is also not touched. Is, my estimate is conservative. It's about 1 billion stolen from the budget each year. So scams, tenders, procurement scams, 1 billion a year. If you take it in the last 10 years, it's 10 billion. What can you do with 10 billion? And these questions are evaded. What we need is an honest debate. Just honest questions. You know, when we were was the president talking to business people, the farmer from the south, I think, Ketmanshoek, he stood up and said, when you have a patient, you have got various doctors who do a diagnosis. We always come up with a wrong diagnosis because we are scared about the right diagnosis. We say, this is this, it's commodity prices, it's the wind, it's the weather, it's something coming through, but we don't say the real things. And that's precisely, we need a doctor who tells us the truth. I think that's maybe you two guys will be the next doctor to tell the truth.
All right, now you sound like the doctor. Can I maybe respond with you somewhat while? I'm also afraid that because, you know, like you said, maybe you're looking after your interests or your brand, or you don't want to step on anybody's toes, etc. Let me ask you, for instance, what do you think about the basic income grant?
It's too expensive, we cannot afford it.
But if we say we've got a wage bill, right, in the budget of 30 billion, and we say we make it a condition, and say we introduce a basic income grant, but it has to become out of the wage bill. Conceptually, for me, it means that instead of paying a certain number of civil servants' wages, you spread it more widely to the people that actually does not have a job, that can't find a job, that are actually hungry. So you make a sum and you do the basic income grant to be deserving individuals, because I mean we've got the system, social security system, we've got the means. We have done it most now in COVID, where we subsidized people paying emergency income. I think there's very little hope for the growth of our people to be employed in the formal sector. What I think is there needs to be some cash injection in those communities where there then becomes like a micro micro business little communities coming up where people stand together, they do things together, there is a little bit of spending power, rather than trying to formalize everything into the formal economy and subject them to the rules and regulations of let's call it commercial business. Look at not only SMEs, like Martin said, but micro businesses. But if you, let's say $500 a month, just that one can actually live and give an injection into those communities where there is so little going on. Because I think in economic research it's also been shown that when incomes increase a little bit, you get a improvement in the social ills. You know, ideologically we say we can't pay people money that doesn't work. You've got to work and then you can eat. But if you can't find work, what then? But if you got a little bit of income going, we think, yeah, but those people, they are just going to spend it on alcohol and drugs and whatnot. Yes, there will be. Some of them will do it, but some people will maybe then get hope. And once you've got hope going, then you've got people interested in life and in economic activity, etc. So I am leaning towards a basic income grant arrangement. However, it got to fit in the current wage bill.
Can I answer your question?
Yeah.
I've seen maybe 200-300 masters and honors theses on the SME sector in the last years. Research done. And the main problem which comes out, the main problem is finance. It's always 70% or 60%, it's access to finance. Now, if we can handle that one, and I give you one example. NAMCOR gets about 80 million a year subsidy from the fuel fund, and NAMCOR alone. And they built filling stations where the private sector is with filling stations. They're making losses on that. If you take the subsidy away, they're making losses. So it comes from the fuel price. It is hidden. It's not coming from the budget. But if you would stop this nonsense, if you would stop saying NAMCOR doesn't get any subsidy from the fuel fund anymore, take the 80 million and give it to the development bank. Make a special, not 50 million, 500 million, 600 million fund. Real things, not pussyfooting. The rest is pussyfooting. It's nothing. And you do things then. And spend $1 billion or 500 million a year on this issue. Not nonsense. You will create employment. And then if you have you can create, there are schemes worldwide where you can assist also. When you say you have a manufacturing enterprise, and if it's successful, that the government is subsidizing the interest rate, that he's not paying 14%, then he's dead anyhow, but that he's paying 8%. If he's successful and he can prove that he pays only 8% interest.
And tax.
And tax, lower tax, that's what I'm writing in the last 10 years. I'm saying, like Canada has got on SMEs a tax of 16%. 16. Holland, 18%. Why not we drop the tax rate of SMEs to 20? Not even 27 or 28, 20, both. And then you say 20% tax. Then you shift up the threshold for value-added tax. It's 500,000 now. It's nonsense. Put it up to 2 million. Everybody under 2 million doesn't pay back. Finished. And then if you've got a 20% tax, If you've got no VAT under 2 million and you've got 1 billion for SME finance, you will see people will get jobs. But the small things.
There is a fund like, is it a 500 million fund for the GPN for this?
Yeah, but go there.
Is it just
I had a discussion with Naha Sambula, my friend. His family members there. So they look at your risk profile, and then they say a 14% interest, and it kills people. 14% interest kills a business, and then it's a joke. It becomes a joke, and we don't have time for jokes anymore.
But you see, Rainer, I think what he raised just now about this voting, the voting patterns that's going to come up. I think, like you said, we're talking about these things for years and years and years and years. But the only way these things are going to change is if you get political change, political pressure, new faces, new thinking, where you have these youths with their masters, they become the Minister of Finance, etc., etc. And then you will get hopefully the changes in policy that we've been talking about. Because I think we've beaten the horse to death on from so many angles. I think there's so many ideas and things that can be done and need to be done and should be done, but doesn't get done.
Well, I think there's a lot of thought processing there, and we will definitely still take more of that after the session. We will still welcome more questions or input on my right hand side. Any questions? Any input? Inside?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jonah Pinke. I just want to raise my intervention in this notorious discussion. So, from the point of economic reconfiguration and orientation, so my extrasensory on this particular issue is to face the reality. So, for the economical leaders, and the utilization of abundant resources with the duly applicable authentic principles of social costs in order to rebasing the private costs. So, I think also that the option of package spending restraint may do attribution to economic strife in the society. Further, it is a fact that most of the businesses currently operating below capacity at the present period, which will take long-term to recovery. So, we have two policies in the country. We have this upcoming policy, which is already effective, which is African Continental Free Trade Area. So, as a country, so are we prepared for this policy that I personally understand that is the main policy that can shape this economy? So we have also 2.2 billion, which was arranged by the government for the stimulant purposes, but it has contributed minimally to the economic revival. So when you look to this 8.2 billion, if it was probably diverted or allocated to the land service alone, this 8.2 million, it could be done something in the society. And also in this presentation, there's nothing that's been spoken about the land service, which is the master of means of production. And if we really also want to change our economy, we have to look from the angle of the land service as well. All right, thank you very much.
So thank you, Rob. Thank you to all the guests who gave really great presentations. So I think in a similar vein to what Reina was saying about experiences with Namibian youth, I am fully for, and even working with the embassy, promoting investment into this country and driving growth that way. But I think I'd be dishonest to say that pushing for growth doesn't always materially improve the lives of low-income households. When you gave your stats, Rob, about sort of where we could derive growth, this 3% growth, etc., I think there's no secret that Namibia is one of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of Gini coefficient, and that's been the case when things were growing well and since then. Right? That hasn't changed. And I think what I'm trying to understand, Rob, and I think this kind of forum sort of gives space to that, is how do you target monetary and fiscal policy to low-income households? Because my concern is that even in an ideal world that we discussed, where you have economic growth, it goes more or less to this side of independence. It doesn't go to the informal space. I mean, if anyone who has lived in this country for the past 10 years, you have materially seen the lack of, or the deterioration in people's lives. You can see it in the amount of people who are begging, or walking through the different neighborhoods, picking up garbage in the bins, and you can see the age of those people, which has changed since COVID-19. And we've had some of these discussions in our youth organization as well. So I think that's what I want to understand. It's not just how you get growth, but how do you get growth that targets low-income people? Because for me, that's the majority of our people, unfortunately. And in my frank opinion, and I think many colleagues in South would agree, if you don't get that sorted, your country remains unstable and fragile. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mofi Gayaki. I'm a medical doctor by profession. But Rob, I just want to touch on a couple of points that you have raised here today. Quite brilliant points, but I think I just want to touch on the low-income grant point as well. I think it's some kind of utopia that we will be thinking about if we are to move in that direction. But I think we in this room as well are people that are well equipped to actually provide some kind of impact to that discussion as well, as opposed to wait for the government to provide a solution for our youth per se, or to provide a solution to the future of the Republic of Namibia. I think we, in our different capacities, can also provide points as to facilitating investments into this youth per se as well, by measure of venture capital, for instance, looking towards avenues in which we can increase venture capital plays in our youth spaces in Namibia as well, and using their talents accordingly as well, because we have to subject them obviously to the context in which they are living in as well. And by that measure, we are then obviously going to propel the youth forward accordingly. So I just actually want to put out the point to say to Capricorn Asset Management Group as well as Serious Capital, to look at avenues in which, via your research firm as well as via your direct asset management units, to look at avenues in which we can actually invest in our youth, in Namibia per se, and by that measure, we're creating avenues of growth accordingly, and not just waiting for the government or whatever sort of case may be to help out or aid in that regard per se. Thank you.
My question is very simple. I just want to hear the views of the panelists on what they think about the sovereign wealth fund. Is it the right time for it, considering that he got 50 million? Not sure. But is it the right time for it, considering the economic theory and also how the budget looks? Yeah, that's my question.
My name is Victoria Ika. I'm a political scientist by profession, and I run an organization called Futuga, which is a youth organization trying to help young people in informal settlements to start their businesses. So my question goes out to our panelists. I just want to understand what can the private sector do to help enhance the Namibian economy and to help the growth of the Namibian economy, looking in terms of youth unemployment. What is our private sector doing to enhance this and to ensure that we understand that we need political backup, but what is the private sector doing to ensure that the country in which they operate is moving forward? Thank you.
My name is Lloyd Falk, representing a youth organization called Real DC, focusing on utilizing the talent of the youth in Karatura. My question is based on how can the civil society organizations work closely together with the government so that the talent and the abilities of our youth can be utilized, their intellectual abilities, so that we can come up with concrete solutions? How can we create a tangible channel of communication within these two sectors, as well as the youth on the ground level? For example, the National Youth Council and we have the National Arts Council. If they are there, how can we enhance these institutions as well? The second question is, we've been focusing on the monetary and fiscal policies, but we have the linkage between South Africa and Namibia. How does this impact the changing fiscal and monetary policy in Namibia? Does our policies really have an impact? Can we really see a change while we are still having a peg for South Africa? So that's my burning question. Thank you very much.
Continental free trade agreement, I'm pro free trade. I just don't see as that alone being the savior. We've got a lot, and if you look at the investment numbers, we need more than just sort of a continental free trade agreement to go in the right direction. But I mean, there's still, if you don't have tariffs, there's also a lot of non-tariff barriers to trade, which cause an issue. So I don't think it is really the main thing. Government spending as a stimulus. Look, government spending does have a lot of leakages, right? And so it's not necessarily the best way to see a stimulus, especially where you've got a government that's got a rapidly increasing debt profile as well as still running large deficits. But I do think we've got a lot of money to spend, right? Government spends around $70 billion a year. That's a lot of money. It's the efficiency of that spend, which was the question. Is government really, I think this touches on a lot of the other points, is government really spending that money as best as it could? I mean, government tends to be involved in a lot of areas where it shouldn't. There should probably be a refocus to say, all right, what areas does government need to be involved in? And focus and channel spending on there. Does government need to be subsidizing entities to be competing with the private sector, where the private sector fulfills that role sufficiently? No. That money could be much better spent on things like land servicing, providing access to land, decent education, access to healthcare, making sure that schools are in good condition. In terms of inequality and inclusive growth, yes, look, Namibia is a highly unequal society. The Gini coefficient does provide a decent measure, but it's also a bit of a flat measure. It's a bit two-dimensional, right? I mean, you can have high inequality, but you can have a country, for instance, where everyone is equally poor. Far more equal society, but it's not necessarily a society you want to be in. So I think the challenge here is that we see this large issue of we've got a shortage of skilled labor and we've got a surplus of relatively less skilled labor. And we're not seeing job creation in the lower one, and we're restricting the ability to create jobs for those people. Firstly, with the policies we maintain, making it difficult to start, operate, run a business, making people not want to invest in this economy, or take their marginal dollars and reinvest it here. And I mean, with skilled people, you tend to see more wider employment as well. So I do think that it's not a quick fix, and there is no quick fix. That's the danger. And I mean, longer term, definitely improvements in education, but those are things, if you improve the reading and writing outcomes in grade 1, that's something you see, sort of 15, 16 years down the line once they finish university. So there isn't a quick fix, and I think it's difficult. Transfers from government do assist to a large extent, right? I mean, I think the old age grant in Namibia has been very successful, and I think it's been a very good introduction, and it's provided a lot of assistance. But you also don't want to be in a situation like South Africa, where you sit with far more people reliant on grants and not able to find work as much as they would like to. And you've got more people relying on those grants than what you have people contributing to those grants through tax. And that's also obviously not sustainable. So, a social safety net is good to have, and I think it's important. But at the same time, I mean, I think for most people, the best dignity you can give them is to provide an environment where they can find work and get gainful employment. And I mean, we see that in Namibia, we talk about 33, I think the 2018 labor force survey was 33.4% unemployment, right? That doesn't, it's high, but it could be a lot worse. But the quality of that employment is very low. Most of those employed people are employed in subsistence agriculture, and that's not really gainful employment. And so the formal employment is much lower, and that's something we definitely need to address. Doesn't mean working for a big multinational or a bank or something, right? It's running your own small company where it's just you employed and maybe one or two other people employed running a small service somewhere. That's still gainful employment. And I think there we need a lot from the policy space, making it easier for people to do that, sort of good grassroots adjustments there. In terms of the venture capital and so on, well, I mean, for venture capital you need money, and I mean, to lend it out for venture capital, often you need to find that money somewhere, and that's a bit difficult. Again, especially in an environment like Namibia where your hurdle rate increases, right? You've got a high corporate tax rate. I mean, at least we've delayed it now, but with the introduction of the dividend tax, you use the return at the end of the day. You've got your VAT thresholds, which have an impact, so all of these things reduce the return at the end of the day. You need someone to come and de-risk that. It could be a lot easier to see improved returns through, like, as has been discussed, a staggered tax profile, for instance, for startups or SMEs or similar. But look, there is some work. It's just it's difficult. There's a lot of competition within that space for the small pools of available funding as well. And I think there things could be done better as well. With, for instance, government focusing on where really they are spending their money. The sovereign wealth fund, in trying to introduce it when you are running large deficits and are relying on the domestic market to fund those. I mean, the initial plan last year was to list MTC, take 1.5 billion of this proceeds for the deficit last year, and the remainder, so anywhere up to 1.5 billion for the sovereign wealth fund. And that's obviously been scrapped. The full proceeds are going to fund the deficit now, and the sovereign wealth fund is only getting 50 million. I think the idea of a sovereign wealth fund and using sort of the country's resources, right, the mineral wealth, so the royalties we get, the fishing rights that people pay for and similar, using those monies in the sovereign wealth fund to see larger benefits for the country is positive. But it's definitely, the timing makes it a bit difficult, but I don't think it's a terrible idea. What can the private sector do for growth? Well, I mean, the private sector is doing what it can, right? We tend to think of the private sector as some inanimate object. It's people going about, doing their jobs, trying to make tomorrow better than today. And what we tend to see is more and more government has made it difficult for that to happen. So often the private sector is trying, and I mean it's far from perfect, and there are improvements that can be made. But in an increasingly restricted environment, it makes it difficult. I mean, with lockdowns, for instance, it's difficult to keep your business open if you don't know if you're allowed to operate tomorrow or not. There's no certainty. Policies can change on a dime. It does make it very, very difficult. And even then, I mean, where you do see people starting their companies, a lot of them are taking either big loans to do it or risking their own money to do it. And at the end of the day, they see very little return for that with the sort of very high effective tax regime we have. Now, I'm not talking about just the corporate tax regime, but the overall tax regime we have. So what do we need to see? Well, we need to see government effectively getting more out of the way. Government can sort of oversee and regulate, right? Make sure there aren't gross human rights abuses, workers aren't being exploited and similar, but not try and direct it on a day-to-day basis, as we're seeing with a lot of the policy creep of late. In terms of CSOs working more closely with government, well, I don't really know many people in government, so I don't know what the best thing is there. But in terms of the currency peg, look, the currency peg at this stage is highly beneficial for Namibia. It means that we have a stable exchange rate, not that the rand is the most stable, but we import a lot from South Africa, and a lot of what we import is imported in terms of South African rand. So with a fixed currency peg, it means that we don't have inflation because of currency movements too much. If we had to depeg, firstly, the Namibian dollar would be a lot weaker than the rand as it stands, unless we have a massive oil field and then things change, but that isn't the case. But with the currency peg as it is, it means that everything we buy from South Africa has the same price every day, unless South Africa is importing it and they have price increases. But it means we've got a lot more stable inflation. If we had, for instance, a floating exchange rate regime in a year like 2014 where you've got massive mining investments, suddenly your currency appreciates a lot because there's a lot of investment inflows. But as soon as that reverses, your currency depreciates dramatically. And so you can see, prices dropping massively from one day and the next day they're shooting up by 100, 200%. So at this rate, I mean, the currency peg is very much beneficial for the country.
Well, thank you, Robert. That's a lot. I think the audience have fully grasped that. Shortly, Florence, just fill in the gaps shortly before we round up.
Maybe I can
just make a comment on the medical doctor's question about venture capital. I think that's been the problem in Namibia for a long time is the mismatch between the demand for capital, the type of demand that's there, and the type of capital that's there. If you think about starting a business, usually the very first thing is you borrow from family. If you can't go to the bank or anywhere else, you borrow from family. And that carries most obviously the risk that you don't repay your uncle and then your uncle goes bust and your business goes bust. Because it's a very risky type of thing to do with venture capital. And the ratios of success to failure in venture capital businesses is atrocious in our minds. You've got to have a venture capital pool of funds that has a certain mandate that can fund venture capital. To just run to the pension funds or just pension funds, that capital belongs to someone. It is somebody's capital. It's not a national asset. It's someone's retirement fund that you need to have when they retires one day. So venture capital is extremely risky for a pension fund to do. There's now been provisions was made for unlisted investments. So pension funds can do unlisted investments, but it's now well structured, and we run such a fund at CAM where we lend money to small businesses, unlisted greenfields projects, etc. So that's been provided, but a lot more can be done on that score. I maybe just concluding from my side. What I like to see, coming back to the theme of the night, is fiscal policy and monetary policy. I would like to see a 10-year strategic plan for fiscal policy to get to a healthy state. Because all businesses have strategies, right? Strategy plan. And then you change the strategy as things change. And you say, okay, we're not going to make budget this year, but the strategy is for this, that, or the other. I think the government minister should sell such a plan to the investment community, domestically and internationally, to say this is the direction fiscal policy is going to go, and our plan is to regain investment grade status after 7 years or wherever. But there's got to be a clear target and real discipline and a real plan. Because just to float along with 5% deficit, 6% deficit, the compounding effect of those deficits are unsustainable.
Thank you, Flores. Thank you, Robert. I think we have come to the end of our panel discussion.